So ask yourself the question, people who know you, would they know you as someone who trusts God, who obeys God, someone who attempts to walk in His will? Or do they just know you as a person who sort of just does whatever comes naturally, and you want to be happy and you want to be successful and you want to fit into the ways of the world? God did not allow you to be born just to do any old thing you wanted to do. That wasn't His plan.
Watch carefully as the Apostle John defines darkness in his context. Darkness comes in a lot of different ways, but what John's talking about here is understanding the work of the Holy Spirit in your life. If you will acknowledge that work and agree with what the Holy Ghost is doing in your life, you won't walk in darkness.
Completed the first 14 chapters of the book of Genesis. In short, the book of Genesis is where we learn about the fundamental truths of God. And we truly learn about God. Today's study takes place in the 15th chapter in the book of Genesis. And through the first 14 chapters, we have learned so much. And the fun continues in chapter 14. Chapter 15 is made up of 21 verses beginning with verse 1. After these things the word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision, saying, Fear not, Abram, I am thy shield, and thy exceeding great reward. And Abram said, Lord God, what wilt thou give me, seeing I go childless? And the steward of my house, is this Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, Behold, to me thou hast given no seed, and lo, one born in my house is mine heir. And, behold, the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, This shall not be thine heir, but he that shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thine heir. And he brought him forth abroad, and said, Look now toward heaven, and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, So shall thy seed be. And he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. And he said unto him, I am the Lord that brought thee out of Ur of the Chaldees, to give thee this land to inherit it. And he said, Lord God, whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it? And he said unto him, Take me an heifer of 3 years old, and a she-goat of 3 years old, and a ram of 3 years old, and a turtle-dove, and a young pigeon. And he took unto him all these, and divided them in the midst, and laid each piece one against another. But the birds divided he not. And when the fowls came down upon the carcasses, Abram drove them away. And when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and, lo, an horror of great darkness fell upon him. And he said unto Abram, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them. And they shall afflict them 400 years, and also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace, thou shalt be buried in a good old age. But in the 4th generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. And it came to pass, that, when the sun went down, and it was dark, behold a smoking furnace, and a burning lamp that passed between those pieces. In the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, Unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates, the Canaanites, and the Kenizzites, and the Cadmonites, and the Hittites, and the Perizzites, and the Rephaim, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. We see from the very beginning that the word of the Lord comes to Abram. And this happens to people differently. While it did happen in the Bible, God still speaks to people today through His Word and dreams. This should be seen as a reassurance as God is ensuring that His promise happens. And this verse details a deep conversation between Abram and God. Here, the word of the Lord comes to Abram in a vision. And God tells Abram not to fear because he is Abram's shield. Abram had just defeated a much larger army made up of a partnership of 4 kings. He had reason to be afraid, expecting an attack of retribution. But it is God that goes forward and fights for us. He is our protector and shield. God knows what Abram is expecting, or at least thinking. And because of Abram defeating 4 kings, attack was probably expected, so God explains He will protect Abram as His shield. And because Abram just turned down a lot of reward, God will see to it that he is rewarded. Charles Spurgeon wrote, "If God be our reward, let us take care that we do really enjoy Him. Let us exult in Him, and let us not be pining after any other joy." Abram asks God what will he get in return, which is not a question of greed. I do not believe. But Abram wanted something more than finances and riches and wealth, but he wanted a son. At some point, every man begins to think about their legacy and what they will leave behind. And to whom, and it appears that Abram was doing this here. Eliezer of Damascus, his servant, is a good man, an honorable man. But he is not a son to Abram. It appears that of all the things he could have, a son is the most important. Abram is bold about his statement, which should be an example of prayer. I'm not sure that Abram was mad or angry at God, maybe so, but it's clear that he was frustrated with the current situation. And at his age, I'm sure it wasn't any easier. And maybe Abram was doubting certain things. But there is a difference between a doubt that denies God's promises and a doubt that desires after God's promises. Studying this chapter helped me understand this principle, as I had not ever thought about it in this sense. God reassures Abram with this explanation. Abram's heir will be his actual, literal son, his own flesh and blood. As it was with Abram, and as it is with us today, God's promises will come to fruition. But it's in His timeline, not ours. Just because things have not come together yet does not mean they will not. Abram needed reminded just like we need reminded at times. This promise was repeated to Abram with such certainty that it was reasonable to suppose that he expected it would be soon fulfilled. But it would be another 15 years before this event would take place. When God instructs Abram to count the stars and the dust, God is reassuring Abram that his offspring would be so numerous as to be uncountable. Abram believed this promise from God, and this made him righteous, as we've seen earlier with Noah. And his righteousness, it was not because of perfection, but instead faith and loyalty to God that made these men righteous. And each of us can be righteous in front of a perfect God. Here is the first time believe is used in the Bible, and the first time righteousness is used in the Bible. And God is clear that He did not deliver Abram from the past for nothing. Or, God explains it, He brought Abram out of his old life, his former home, for this very purpose, to give him and his descendants land. Spurgeon writes, "What? Abraham, is not God's promise sufficient for thee? Ah, beloved!" Faith is often marred by a measure of unbelief or, if not quite unbelief. Yet there is a desire to have some token, some sign, beyond the bare promise of God. Abram is righteous in front of God, but he is not a perfect or flawless being. And while he believed, he had no deed or certificate that said this land belonged to him. We read from in the next verse formalizing that covenant promise. The first step in this verse is a list of animals Abram was to bring before the Lord, a heifer. goat, and ram, each 3 years old, along with a turtle dove and young pigeon. The processes which follow emphasize the seriousness of this promise on the part of God. It also includes a surprising prophecy about the future of Abram's large family. While this verse may read like a shopping list, the symbolism was clear. First, this is a covenant so serious, it is sealed with blood. Second, if I break this covenant, let this same bloodshed be poured out on my animals and me. This is how God works as He makes a covenant, and He sees it through, and that it is protected. Abram had reason to expect that God would come down and walk through the animal parts with him, because God had previously appeared to him in some way of the first few verses. Spurgeon sums up like this: perhaps he did not doubt the promise, but he wanted to have it explained to him. He may have wondered if it meant that one born in his house, though not his son, was to be his heir, and that, through him, the blessing would come. He takes the opportunity of making an inquiry, that he may know how to act. At the same time, there does seem to be a clashing between Abraham's question, "What wilt thou give me?" and the declaration of God, "I am thy shield, and thy exceeding great reward." There is a great descent from the language of the Lord to that of the most stable believer. And when you and I are even at our best, I have no doubt that, if all could be recorded that we think and say, some of our fellow believers would feel that the best of men are but men at the best, and that God's language is after a nobler fashion than ours will ever be, till we have seen His face in glory. Spurgeon explains of the covenant made here between Abram and God of what's asked. Here is a lesson for us. Perhaps you have some of these unclean birds coming down upon your sacrifice just now. That raven that you did not lock up well at home has come here after you. Eagles and vultures, and all kinds of kites in the form of carking cares, and sad memories, and fears, and doubts, come hovering over the sacred feast. Drive them away. God give you grace to drive them away by the power of His gracious Spirit. Researching the happenings here, we find that there is a reason God asked Abram to do what's instructed. It may appear this was a ceremony-like circumstance, but in these days, contracts were made by the sacrificial cutting of animals, with the split carcasses of the animals lying on the ground. The covenant was made when parties to the agreement walked through the animal parts together, repeating the terms of the covenant. As illustrated in the text, Abram waited for the Lord to appear and walk through the carcasses with him, the signing of the covenant. But God didn't come right away. He had to wait and fight off the vultures until God appeared to complete the covenant ceremony. An important lesson for us is to learn to wait on God and His timing. As evening came, God had not yet appeared to walk through the animal parts with Abram and seal the covenant. Instead, God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Abram. Notice previously that God instructed Abram to look up at the stars, but now he is sleeping. Now, it appears that Abram seems supernaturally overpowered by a deep sleep and a great and dreadful darkness. Once in the sleep, Abram is told of some of the hardships that will befall his descendants, so this was probably difficult to hear, as nobody wants to think their kin will have it rough. But there will be a long rough history for some of these people. But as it was dark, Abram saw God come through the animal parts. And this is the covenant being signed by God. In walking through the sacrificed animals in the covenant ceremony, God represented Himself by two emblems, a smoking oven and a burning torch. Remember this fact: the certainty of the covenant God made with Abram is based on who God is, not on who Abram is or what Abram would do. This covenant could not fail, because God cannot fail. God makes it clear that the covenant is not a spiritual promise, as He names specific areas and lands of Abram's people, so we can rest assured it was not a figurative promise. This promise comes along with God's prior reassurance that Abram will, in fact, see a natural-born son, but like many great things, it will take time to complete. And for Abram, he will have to continue to be patient, although he had been for so long. As one illustration I found explains, God was binding himself to do as he promised no matter what Abram or Abram's descendants did or did not do. Put another way, this promise from God to the people of Israel to give them this land was a unilateral covenant. As we come to the end of chapter 15, God is defining certain areas and certain groups of people. And again, this is proof that the promise is a real physical one, not just spiritual. First 15 chapters, we have learned so much. And the fun continues in chapter 16. Chapter 16 is made up of 16 verses beginning with verse 1. Now Sarai Abram's wife bare him no children, and she had an handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold now, the Lord hath restrained me from bearing, I pray thee. Go in unto my maid, it may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. And Sarai Abram's wife took Hagar her maid the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. And he went in unto Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. And Sarai said unto Abram, My wrong be upon thee, I have given my maid into thy bosom. And when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between me and thee. But Abram said unto Sarai, Behold, thy maid is in thine hand, do to her as it pleaseth thee. And when Sarai dealt hardly with her, she fled from her face. And the angel of the Lord found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness, by the fountain in the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, whence camest thou? And whither wilt thou go? And she said, I flee from the face of my mistress Sarai. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Return to thy mistress, and submit thyself under her hands. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shalt call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. And he will be a wild man, his hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. And she called the name of the Lord that spake unto her, Thou God sayest me, for she said, Have I also here looked after him that seeth me? Wherefore the well was called Beer-lahai. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bare Abram a son, and Abram called his son's name, which Hagar bare, Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old, when Hagar bare Ishmael to Abram. Chapter 16 opens up with a plan from Sarai that would seem to grasp at desperation. From the last chapter, chapter 15, God tells Abram that he will have descendants, and they will not be servants but actual heirs. Chapter 16 starts out with Sarai and her indentured servant, Hagar, and a plan to create heirs for Abram and Sarai. Although we are not told for sure, it does not appear that Abram has shared the message he received from God with Sarai. But she does not seem to trust God's work in this situation. Another possibility I found from another study, it's possible she doubted that Abram's heir was meant to be born through her. Sarai has a plan for Abram to produce a child, or children, with Hagar. And this is a wild way of thinking. But when we go away from God's plan, our actions typically reek of desperation. Spurgeon explains that very likely Hagar was one of the slaves given to him by Pharaoh when he dismissed him and Sarah, and you know what trouble Hagar brought into the family. If Abraham had lived a separated life, and had not fallen into the customs of those round about him, he would not have had that sin and sorrow concerning Hagar, nor would he have had that righteous rebuke from Abimelech, the king of Gerar, when again he had acted deceitfully with regard to his wife. While it appears that Sarai did not trust what she had heard of God's plan, she did understand that God had control over her womb, but these words really hurt Sarai. She was tired of waiting, and was at the point of doing most anything to accomplish an heir. She was willing to go outside of God's plan, but as with the situation of Adam and Eve, and Adam not sharing the details with Eve, it appears the same is true here with Abram and Sarai, and she entertains the idea of a surrogate mother situation, or adultery. Although Sarai trusted that God was the one that made her womb barren, she did not trust that the plan given to Abram was going to happen, so much so she acted against the plan. It seems like she believes that Abram will become a father of many nations. But maybe she's not the mother. It's unclear what direction her thinking was in, but what's clear is she's confused. Perhaps worse is Abram went through with what Sarai offered to him. And while this may have been a normal custom during this period of time, it was outside of God's will. Perhaps it was God preventing them from having a child until he was ready. But Sarai did not want to wait anymore, and apparently neither did Abram. I say this because he goes through with the idea, and both acted out of unbelief. Abram had met personally with God, just like Adam had, so he knew what the plan was. But despite first-hand knowledge, he acted out of unbelief. We are all guilty of this at one point or another. For Abram, although he did not marry Hagar, he did commit adultery. We are told that it had been 10 years since the promise was made to Abram, so it's easy to understand why Abram and Sarai lost patience. 10 years is a long time, but this is why we are supposed to live by faith, not by sight. According to research, culture during this period perceived barrenness as a sign of divine disapproval, and while the plan to impregnate Hagar may have seemed like a perfect route around the barren problem, there was a curveball in that Hagar would come to resent Sarai. Honestly, who couldn't see this coming? For Sarai, Abram and Hagar conceiving a child was bad because she knew that was her fault. A failure on her end, not to be able to give a child to Abram. And their culture was very high on childbearing. According to culture, mothering the child of a wealthy and influential man like Abram gave a servant girl like Hagar greater status, and made her appear more blessed than Sarai. This led to Hagar thinking she was better than Sarai, so what was the need for Sarai? This whole situation was made worse because of an act of unbelief. Later, and not much later, Sarai blamed the whole situation on Abram. Let's be honest, she had a gripe with Abram indeed, as he should have acted as the spiritual leader, and told his wife that God was able to perform what he promised, and they didn't need to try to perform God's promise by disobeying him and relying on man's strength and wisdom. Because he did not, the situation literally became a Jerry Springer episode. Sarai acknowledges that Hagar despises her and is acting as though she's better than Sarai. It's clear that Hagar had no intentions of giving birth to a child of Abram and remaining a slave to Sarai. By Sarai explaining her feelings to Abram, I believe he realized the wrongs in his decision. But he made a mistake by allowing Sarai to handle the situation herself. But he put his relationship first, which was a good thing. However, the entire situation was a mess, and it's hard to see an easy or good way out. We are told that Sarai took care of the situation, at least she confronted Hagar and scolded her, which seems to have put fear into Hagar as she fled from Sarai. There is speculation that she headed back to Egypt, which is where she was from. But we read that Hagar's escape led her to a spring. Perhaps she was afraid to go further and leave this supply of water, but regardless, the angel of the Lord met her. The angel was in physical form, present, speaking to her just like another person. This is the first appearance of the angel of the Lord in the Bible, so think about this as the angel of the Lord first appeared to a single mother-to-be who had a pride problem and was mistreated by the woman who put her into the whole mess. Without question, God is a merciful and loving God. There are two important questions asked by the angel to Hagar. Two questions that each of us need to ask ourselves from time to time. Where have you come from, and where are you going? Hagar's response was different than most of ours. But we all have a story. She responded, I flee from the face of my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord tells her to return to thy mistress, and submit thyself under her hands. The child to be born will be used abundantly, as the seed will be used exceedingly. But it does appear that due to the plan being rushed, there will be consequences. The angel informs that the child will be a boy, a son, and his name will be Ishmael. Ishmael means God has heard, which is telling Hagar God heard, and has stepped in. This should be a reminder to each of us that God hears, He still works, but it's on His timetable. Notice what God is doing here. For example, God not only implied a promise of protection, but He also gave a clear promise of staggering blessing. A fun note is Ishmael was the first person to be given a name before his birth. But not all of this lineage will be favorable. Ishmael apparently has a strong lineage, but he is not the promised child that God guaranteed Abram. The verse explains that Ishmael will be like a wild donkey, meaning he will not be a people person, and will have hostility towards those around him. Again, back to the mercy of God, as He could have allowed Hagar and her unborn child to die in the wilderness, He didn't allow it. God specifically intervened so that wouldn't happen. According to the text, it appears that Hagar knew this visitor was more than just a regular person, describing him as the God who sees. It does appear that Hagar returns back to Abram and Sarai submissive, and gives birth to the child, naming him Ishmael. It's an important lesson for us all, and probably to Abram and Sarai, as well as their experiment attempting to bring about God's promise on their own timeline. They have learned He was still listening, still seeing, and would still keep His promises to Abram. Ishmael would be blessed by God, but his descendants would constantly be at conflict with others, and his birth came with bother, blessings, and burdens, which is what happens when we take things into our own hands.